Detroit's gonna work. Now listen to this. Detroit's going to work. Miss your shoes on your feet. But Detroit's going to work. Watch that clock is trying to run. It's time to go to work.
The Detroit Pistons entered the offseason with one clear objective in mind: gain more position flexibility and versatility on the court, as Stan Van Gundy turned Detroit's roster into a winning product. Adi Joseph, an NBA editor for the Sporting News, joined me on Friday to give his perspective on the state of the Pistons.
Yeah, the Pistons have made a lot of really nice moves toward having a better skill set of forward, particularly surrounding center Andre Drummond. I think they think Drummond is definitely the guy they want to build around, and having last year they started with Josh Smith and Greg Monroe next to him, and those guys were not good fits around a guy like Monroe. They drafted Stanley Johnson. They brought in for very low price Marcus Morris. And then the move that I really liked was Ersan Ilyasova. They traded for him from the Bucks, and he's going to give them a real shooter to put at the power forward spot, because Drummond's such a good rebounder. He doesn't need a traditional power forward like Monroe to be playing next to him. So I think they accomplished most of their goals this offseason. They locked up Reggie Jackson. It was definitely a good offseason in terms of what Van Gundy wanted to accomplish and getting the kind of players who fit his system.
Now, when we look at what the Pistons did in the draft, obviously Stanley Johnson has made a buzz during his time in the Summer League, and Larry Bird of the Indiana Pacers had some nice things to say about him. So can you tell me about your thoughts on what the Pistons did in the draft and what Stanley Johnson brings to this particular roster?
I think Stanley Johnson is a guy who he's not going to be immediately ready to step in. He's young. He still needs a lot of polish, but he has the potential to be a rare player who can guard at least three positions. He can definitely guard shooting guards, small forwards, and power forwards. Putting him next to Ilyasova is a nice blend, and it reminds me of what Van Gundy had when he was the Magic head coach. He had Hedo Turkoglu, who was kind of a do-everything small forward in the same mold that Johnson could one day be. And then he had Rashard Lewis, who was a corner three-point shooting, offensive-minded power forward who had great height and could help out with rebounding and could defend a little bit, but was mostly going to be there for his shooting. And that's what Ilyasova is going to be. So I thought it was interesting to see them pass on Justice Winslow, who I liked a lot, but I thought that Stanley Johnson was a pretty good fit for them.
Now, when we look at the Pistons re-signing Reggie Jackson, obviously he was the big ticket item for that team, and I believe that Reggie Jackson received the biggest contract in Pistons history, and obviously if they want to get to where they want to go, his development is key. So can you explain to me the importance of his development and how you think he fits in as a Piston?
Yeah, Reggie's a divisive addition because he hadn't really done all that much to earn that kind of contract up until the final months of the season. In his last 20 games, though, Reggie Jackson was one of the 10 best point guards in the NBA. And so that kind of assured that they wanted to keep him around. The big question for him is, can he improve his shooting? He shot pretty well at the end of the season, but now he's got to make that more consistent, and he's really got to run the offense in the way that they need it run, which is through Drummond from the inside out, using him in both pick and rolls and in just more traditional, just getting the ball to the playmakers. If Reggie Jackson is trying to force it too often, like he sometimes did in Oklahoma City, this could be a really bad move. But if not, he's young and he's very athletic, and he could be a pretty good player for them.
Now, both Jeff Bauer and Stan Van Gundy said that finding a starting caliber small forward was tops on their priority list, and they came up with a trade for Marcus Morris from Phoenix. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that addition as a whole and the rest of the Pistons free agent class. I know you said you liked the Ilyasova addition as well.
Yeah, Marcus Morris is an interesting player who it's going to be very interesting to see him removed from his brother, Markieff, who's the better of the Morris twins. They played together really well in Phoenix, but Marcus had struggled away from Markieff in the past. And I'm not entirely sure that Marcus Morris is a starting small forward. I think he's at his best as a backup combo forward, but he definitely should help ease the transition before Stanley Johnson's ready to take over as the starting small forward. In the meantime, they don't really have a ton of other options at a traditional small forward role. Cartier Martin is still on the team. Danny Granger could actually be a short-term starter if he's healthy. He hasn't really been in years, but he once was an all-star. So they have some choices, but it's definitely they're holding out for when Stanley Johnson's ready to take that job. They're not gonna lock themselves into a player who might block Johnson's progress.
Now, prior to his injury, the Pistons, even though they ended the season at 32-50, Brandon Jennings was a player that was coming into his own for them. So I'm wondering, with the firm addition of Johnson, what your thoughts are on how Brandon Jennings and Reggie Jackson can coexist on the floor together.
That's a difficult question to answer. Jackson's definitely a guy who wants to play point guard. He played shooting guard next to Russell Westbrook a lot, but he didn't like that role. And they just invested $80 million in a guy who views himself as a point guard. So you take a guy like Brandon Jennings, who absolutely is a point guard. Jennings can't really do much else. But he, like you said, he was playing really, really well before he got hurt. And in January, he averaged 20.9 points and 7.2 assists a game, and he actually shot the ball well. So it's going to be tough for him, if he is healthy, to accept a smaller role, and they may end up having to trade him. But right now, they're still seeing where his ACL is and how his knee is going to be, and whether he can regain that quick first step that's so important to his game. So I think the best way to put it with Brandon Jennings is they've got to see what kind of player he is before they trade him, because he doesn't have a ton of value right now as a trade piece if teams don't know how good he is anymore.
Now, do you think he would be open to the possibility of coming off the bench, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I love Brandon Jennings. He's been one of my favorite players for years, and I've interviewed him a couple times, and he thinks that he's the best point guard in the league, which is one of the reasons that he's good. It's a lot of good players think that they're great. And I think that if he is healthy and he feels good, he's not going to want to come off the bench. If he knows he's a step slow, if he feels like this season is kind of a lost cause anyway, he may be more willing to play out his contract, hit free agency, and hopefully have a strong finish to the season as a sixth man. But I definitely expect in the long term he will want to get a starting chance again.
Now, for the Pistons, the core foundation for them starts with Andre Drummond, and next year he'll be a restricted free agent. And with with 20 teams expected to get significant cap space in the summer of 2016, do you think that the Pistons would be wise to sign him to a long-term extension now, or would you anticipate them taking the risk and letting him play out the season and doing this tap dance again next year?
You know, it's a complicated question that has a lot more to do with. Let's start with this. The Pistons will match any offer on Drummond, barring some terrible season where everything goes wrong. The Pistons are going to match whatever contract offers he gets. So he's not going to be on any other team. But from a salary cap perspective, there are a lot of reasons to not lock a guy up yet, because if they sign him to a long-term contract now, a contract extension this offseason, then they won't have as much salary cap space next offseason to try to help and get more guys around him. So I think it can be mutually beneficial to wait until next season, especially given that Drummond has yet to really, truly prove himself as a top tier center. And I think he will this season, and he'll prove that he's worth whatever contract he wants and can get.
Now, when you look at what Stan Van Gundy has done, he's obviously taken the Pistons and molded them in his image, or the way he wants them molded. So I'm wondering if you could give me a thumbnail on the job you think Stan Van Gundy has done thus far, and whether you think Detroit is headed in the right direction under his leadership.
Yeah, the coach / president role is kind of controversial. The only guy who's had a whole lot of success in building a team while also being the coach is Greg Popovich. But I think that Van Gundy has a good GM in Jeff Bauer who will help him through all the more sophisticated elements that come with running a team. He's made some rash decisions, though. Simply cutting Josh Smith instead of trying to find a trade partner is going to cut into this team's salary cap. And the decision to sign Jody Meeks for a lot of money was a surprise to me last offseason. I think he's still feeling out what exactly he has. I was a little surprised by how much he paid Aaron Baines this offseason. So I think the best answer to that is he's building the team he wants, which is a good thing because the coach and the GM, you want them to be on the same page, and so they're going to be if they're the same person. I don't agree with all of his moves, but I think he still has a team that can make a playoff run next season.
Now, you led into my next question about where the Pistons stack up, and still a weaker Eastern Conference, but if you look at their own division in Milwaukee, who's gotten better this offseason, with coming back from injury with Jabari Parker. They've also added Greg Monroe. And then you look at Cleveland and the retention of their big three, and even Indiana and Chicago. So I'm wondering where you let the Pistons stack up in their division, the conference, and the rest of the NBA.
It's tough because the East is weaker at the top, other than the Cavs, but the East had a lot of injury issues last year. In particular, the Pacers, the Heat, and the Hornets were destroyed by injuries, and they were the three teams that didn't make the playoffs that were directly ahead of the Pistons. So I think you're going to see. I mean, to break it down, you can pretty much guarantee that the Cavs, the Bulls, the Hawks, the Raptors, the Wizards, and the Bucks are going to make it into the playoffs again. That's 6 spots right there. 6 spots off the board. So then you've got 2 spots, the Celtics spot and the Nets spot last year. And those 2 teams actually got better this offseason in some ways. The Pacers definitely are better now, especially if Paul George is healthy. The Heat should be a lot better. And I think we can almost count the Heat into the playoffs. So with all of that said, I mean, it's going to be a fight for that 8th seed in the East. there's going to be a lot of teams who are hovering right around 500, and the Pistons can get themselves into that mix if Reggie Jackson and Andre Drummond are ready to lead them there. But they're going to need help. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope needs to have a much better season, and they need to prove themselves in a way that some of those younger guys haven't yet. It'll be an interesting season for Detroit, but I think they could make a push to the playoffs.
And you brought this up earlier. I just wanted to go back to Josh Smith and the stretch provision on the Pistons salary cap implications, because he did sign a veteran minimum contract yesterday with the Los Angeles Clippers. And obviously, his time here in Detroit didn't go as planned, obviously. So I'm wondering how the implications of Josh Smith will affect the Pistons moving forward.
Well, it's just another about $5 million or so off the books that they don't have to spend in the future. It also kind of brings up that point I was making about Drummond, where if Drummond signs an extension this season, especially a max level extension for the future, that Josh Smith deal just cuts another $5.4 million out of the books next season, and it starts to become pretty tight for them to have the max salary cap room that you mentioned earlier that most teams are going to have next offseason. So it's $5.4 million through several more seasons. In the foreseeable future, they will be paying Josh Smith $5.4 million a year to not play for them. And I wish I was getting $5.4 million not to play for someone. But
don't we all? Absolutely.
It's a little short-sighted, and it was a questionable move not to stretch it. They definitely made the right move to stretch the contract. It's just that it's going to really hurt them in the long run.
And my final question for you is, if the Pistons are to be successful this offseason or going into next season, what are the top three things that they should focus on to ensure success?
I think the first thing is to develop their wing players, especially Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who has not shown the kind of progress that they were hoping for when they took him 8th overall, and Stanley Johnson, who they certainly hope is the starting shooting guard of the future. If they can develop a starting lineup with Reggie Jackson, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Stanley Johnson, Ersan Ilyasova, and Andre Drummond, they're going to feel really good about that. The other thing is that they need to figure out which of all of these role players that they brought in, who can potentially, who's there for the long haul, and what is their plan for their entire rotation, not just for this season, but over the long course. They've got a bit of an older supporting cast, and I think that they may still need to find some depth there. And then my final thing would be they need to figure out as soon as possible what's going to happen to Brandon Jennings for the reasons we talked about earlier.
I have one follow-up for you. In terms of the Joe Dumars effect, how do you think the numerous mistakes he made during his time here, especially during his later years as Pistons GM, how much do you think those mistakes are hurting the Pistons now?
I think Dumars is the reason that I think some of those moves that Joe Dumars made played a big role in Greg Monroe's alienation with the team. But then I think it was on Stan Van Gundy, who declined to trade Monroe, even though he knew Monroe wasn't coming back. It's a hard break when you lose a really good big man for nothing in free agency, and that's something that the Pistons are going to have to figure out how to answer for. I certainly the Josh Smith contract is that was Dumars who signed that, but the roster they have now. And another one was trading Brandon Knight and Chris Middleton, who's become a really good player, for Brandon Jennings. That was a Dumars trade that now looks really bad. On the other hand, most of the players now on the roster are Van Gundy's guys. It's just a little bit less flexibility and a little bit less talent that he has to work with than maybe he should have if Dumars had made better moves.
Well, Addy, we thank you for your time this afternoon and for joining us on the Two Man Advantage podcast and talking some Pistons basketball with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.